Welcome to Eclecticist. Eclecticist is an exploration of everything, one topic at a time. Based in London and California, we take a very British perspective with a heavily colloquial bent on topics that either interest us or we feel warrants investigation. Our mission is to educate ourselves while researching and discussing a spectrum of interesting and mostly contemporary areas with the fringe benefit of distributing the value to any and all listeners. If you can, please spend a little bit of time, have a conversation with your friends, and if you will, send along some feedback, which you'll find a link to on our page eclecticist.co.uk. We are Benjamin de Campos, a designer and believer based in California, and Jeffrey Campos, an engineer and devil's advocate based in London, England. Our mode is to choose a topic, which we have, and our current topic for tonight is Cenk Uygur and his interview of Sam Harris. We're recording this show on the 2nd of May, 2015.
We should probably say which is which of us two. I am Benjamin.
And I'm Jeffrey.
You didn't have to say that. I think that was implicit. So let me just give us an overview of what we're going to be talking about. This is an analysis of the conversation between Cenk Uygur and Sam Harris, and a wider discussion of the reflexive Harris bashing in certain liberal circles being critical of Islam. Is it fair to be marginalized for making similar noises to right-wing bigots? Hitler may have been right regarding certain tenets of evolution by natural selection, but for the most part, intelligent people don't reject that evolution is a fact. What's with this double standard? Also, how big a part does white guilt play into this? Criticizing Islam is tantamount to criticizing a race of dark-skinned people. Harris and others often preface their comments with reminding us that Islam is a collection of ideas and that any criticism leveled at it applies just as much to white converts. It just so happens that the vast majority of Muslims aren't white, so you just can't say these things, honkey. Wait, Ayaan Hirsi Ali isn't white, and she gets a heck of a lot of pushback, particularly from Uygur, who's thrown a fair few barbs in her direction. Uygur says a lot of nasty-ass stuff about Pat Robertson and Ken Ham and many other Christian lunatics with no restraint or sensitivity, but stops sort of going too heavy on any particular Muslim. What's going on here? Jeff?
Well, I think it's important to mention that we're not talking about aspartame, the very popular non-sugar synthetic sweetener, and we are also not going to talk about the 2016 Mercedes-AMG GTS. We won't mention those two topics.
Maybe for another podcast.
Perhaps. I think it was a difficult interview. It was a very long interview, 3 hours almost on the dot. And I don't think they made much headway, but I think there was quite a bit of value in the interview. I thought it was very entertaining. They covered a lot of topics. I thought they had good points. I thought Cenk had a few good points. I don't particularly like his interviewing style. And I do like Sam Harris's lack of style and his consistency. And he's very eloquent. And he really understands the topics that he brings along, even if nobody else does. So I did enjoy it, but I thought it was very difficult and arduous listen. And I had to listen to it a couple of times, I have to say, and take some notes so I could remember what they were talking about. But it certainly did seem to be an appeal from Sam Harris against what he felt was defaming interviews that were held prior to his show, which I think was in the end of October.
Yes. And I didn't, I thought it was interesting. I enjoyed it. I didn't find it arduous. I found it flabbergasting at many points. As Sam Harris said, Cenk was trying very hard to miss the point. And I couldn't help but think that there was quite a lot of ego involved on Cenk's point of view. He was kind of, he didn't want to back down, even when he was right up against the wall. But his sort of bully-like persona and his ego and all that stuff just wouldn't let him concede anything, to the point where he looked a bit foolish, I thought, by faced with almost black and white arguments about certain things when they were black and white. He was just still adamant and dug his heels in and stuff. And I think that did him great harm in my eyes.
Again, I didn't like I don't care for his style. I'm not familiar with the Young Turks. I've seen a few snippets here and there of their programming, and I understand that they're quite prolific in their news analysis and interviews with popular talking heads. But what I have seen, I haven't been too impressed, and I certainly don't think I'll be listening to many unless they're linked by people who I just do listen to on the internet, mostly through podcasts. I did see an interview that Anna Kasparian had with Stefan Molyneux, who's another very polarizing philosopher on the
problem is with people like that. Again, this is a sort of wider point. Now, you mentioned earlier about how Sam's eloquence and all this stuff, but I think a bigger point is just honesty, intellectual integrity, and all this other stuff. And what those 3 hours showed me was that Cenk has very little. And the fellow you just mentioned, he's another one. He's just some loudmouth lunatic. Whereas Harris was just, by contrast, shown to be so reasonable. And he's able to sort of speak in a way where when people challenge him, it's the people who challenge him that immediately come across as being shifty. Or Sam says, playing hide the ball with the truth or whatever, something like that. And it's true. It's just like, what the hell? And I think what Cenk does, quite obviously to me, was he appeals to the people who don't really know the facts. He's not interested in the facts, really. And so whenever Sam Harris, and we'll get to this when we get into the sort of the meat of this, whenever Sam Harris sort of talks, and it's from the position of knowing the numbers, Cenk's always sort of, well, let's put that to one side and duck past that. I'm just going to tell you just sort of what I think rather than, where the data takes us. And I find that happens a lot, right? And he does that about maybe 4 or 5 times during this. And what's ironic about that is during some Young Turks show that was very shortly after what started this whole thing, which we should talk about, which is the Ben Affleck, Bill Maher contretemps. Where Sam Harris, he said this statistic. I can't remember what it is. Something like 75% or something. I don't have the number here. But Cenk, when he was talking about this on his show, he played the clip and then he stopped after Sam Harris said this number of however many British Muslims think that certain blasphemy laws should be taken seriously, or something like that.
Just from the infamous Pew results.
Yeah, which I've actually posted on here, by the way. It's in the show notes. And then you see Cenk go, did you see what Sam Harris did there? He said, there were certain Pew results. He just made that up. But that's what Cenk said. And that's exactly what he does.
Let's first acknowledge and establish that 20% number totally made up. And you could tell when Affleck said, hey, what poll are you basing that? A series of polls. Really? Which one said 20%? Or how did you combine them to get to the 20% number? No, you made that number up. Okay, let's just be honest about that.
Sam Harris talked about the percentage of based on poll results of Muslims who believe that the Quran is the true word of the creator of the universe. And he said something like 90%. Then Cenk just goes, Christian poll will be just the same. He just said that. And it's like Sam Harris goes, no, it isn't. No, it's not the same. It's half that. And it just goes right off the bat. Cenk just says stuff that he has absolutely no data for, apart from just what he thinks. And he just, because he thinks it, maybe it's a fact. And so that's...
No, he does work in the media, so you have to expect this.
Well, that's cynical.
Off the cuff opinions with no basis in the real world is their meat and potatoes.
Should
But
we talk about the Ben Affleck thing?
I think, well, before we do, Cenk, and like most of the presenters on the Young Turks, have very strong opinions, and they tend not to back those opinions up with any sort of conscientious research in fact. And
Yes.
I think Sam Harris, probably everybody is accosted by this sort of ignorant blurting of opinion. But Sam Harris, he really underlines it, and he amplifies it for everyone's edification. And I think that's a real service that he provides, because you can really see the struggle here. I mean, the topics that interest Sam Harris and the topics he writes about require very careful consideration. The facts really do matter. The details really matter. And it's very unfortunate that he seems to find his nemesis in people who simply haven't done the work to give him a good argument. So it's usually embarrassing. Most other people he speaks to seem to just embarrass themselves. It's terrible. I think it's quite easy to misrepresent Sam Harris's views because they're very complex. His thesis is very sophisticated, and I think on first hearing, someone's liberal bone may force them to, kick up and complain against what they perceive to be quasi-racist accusations.
Well, this is the white guilt problem I was telling you about.
I think it's built into all of us to a certain extent.
I don't think it is. I think there just is something just very unsavory about this guy standing up and then speaking so disparagingly about people of different color who have not been as economous. And the reason why this is the blanket, Robert Pape thing, that they're not prosperous is simply because of the West. That is the problem. Here we are. We've been looting and plundering all the world's resources for our own gains, exploiting all of the people who aren't quite white like we are.
Oh, indeed. Pape says you are naive if you believe that we haven't engineered the socio or geopolitical format of the planet as it is today to a very, very significant degree.
Yeah, but I just think that's really, again, that's just very simplistic. And I agree with both Cenk and Harris that, it's a combination of things. But it is certainly true that there are a lot of things that the West had nothing to do with. This whole, the killing that goes on between Sunni and Shia,
Nobody likes the Sufis.
Yeah, we didn't have anything to do with that.
In the Muslim.
Who succeeded the Prophet Muhammad? We didn't plant any of that in what's going on there between them, killing each other, and lots of other things. But there's a recent bit of news that's been really horrible. This Afghan woman who was set on fire because this angry mob thought she was burning pages from the Quran, right? I mean, what the hell? And the Charlie Hebdo, for example, it's like, well, what does Western imperialism have to do with that load of crap?
Well, there certainly are a lot of aspects of the ideology seemingly embraced by the Muslim world that we have a problem with. And I say we as in Westerners, as in the Christian West, Christendom, basically. But that's only to be expected between different worldviews. It's just simply going to happen. You're always going to look at the other group, the out group, and think they're different from us. Their values are different from us. They're wrong. We have the right idea. They clearly have the wrong idea. So that will always happen.
Okay, we should talk about
understand. I think you might always think that you're the good guy, and that everybody is the good guy, and it's a relative game.
Okay, well, let me stop you there because I think this is important because what you've made that sound like is that everyone and everything is just all equal, and I think that's kind of Cenk's view, particularly we're talking about this topic, where he doesn't see Islam as a collection of ideas to be any worse than Christianity and Judaism. He says they're all equally bad. And any time that Sam Harris suggested that that's not the case, or you're being too loose with Christianity here, and this sort of thing, Cenk would come back and say things like, Christianity is by far the most violent religion in the whole of history. And it's just like, well, where the hell did you get that from? And I think this reluctance to admit that things aren't all the same for lots of different reasons.
Well, again, I think the specter of political correctness creeps into the conversation.
Of course it does.
Because nobody really wants to say, it's not a weighting game in that you weight the threats offered by different doctrines. That belief system is ridiculous and ludicrous, and more ludicrous than this belief system over here.
How much time do we have?
Less ludicrous. And this one over here is completely outrageous and bonkers. The reason why is because it's difficult to get quantitative when you're talking about these supernatural-based belief systems. And I understand the sentiment that Cenk is espousing there. I think his unwillingness to start weighing up the different systems of faith. I get that motivation, but realistically speaking, and I think Sam Harris speaks realistically, he is saying, look, you have Jainism, just as deranged as any other system of belief, but less of a threat to us. Islam is a threat to us because they are telling us that we are the great Satan, we are the kafir, and we're not getting to heaven, and we are to be despised, and ideally we should all be killed or be relegated to dimitude in
if you're a person of the
societies. Yeah, if you're a person of the book, then you can sort of live in semi-slavery and be exploited and always be looked down upon. But I mean, you find that in every religion, of course. But Sam's reason that very specific. Sam's argument is that very specific beliefs have very specific behavioral outcomes.
Yeah, which I think.
Cenk's argument is, yes, that's true, but there is a geopolitical context. So there's an oven that you cook those motivations in, and if you build a more moderate, technologically advanced, and therefore more comfortable society and culture, then these erroneous beliefs in the central doctrine will be marginalized and talked away. And I see his point as well. I think, but then the counterpoint from Sam Harris is that these doctrinal specifications are extremely difficult to marginalize in the Quran and the Hadith and all the surrounding texts, which is true. And this gives flesh to Sam's argument that you really can weigh religious identities against each other in terms of threats. And he sees Islam as the greatest threat. He thinks that they are, morally speaking, they are, living in the 15th century. Almost literally living the 15th century, because that's the current year in Islam.
Yeah, but you should be careful.
In the 1400s.
No, but you should be careful with what you're doing there, because you started to say.
He said this. He said it.
Yeah, I know, but you were then just there speaking generally and loosely. You said what Muslims believe is such and such and such and such, and there is this spectrum. But I think what we want to focus on is the Muslims who actually do believe that, rather than the moderates and all the other people who don't adhere to the strict tenets. The ones who you could say aren't strictly Muslim. But I think what happened there was that we were doing what Cenk would have an epi about, by saying Muslims believe X. I think there could be an argument that that is a little bit unfair to generalize. So I think the way Sam Harris sort of kind of painted this, which I thought was really good, was that if you're talking about X percentage of Muslims believe this, then we are talking about those Muslims rather than all Muslims in general.
Yes, obviously. I mean, it's
not obvious.
difficult. It is obvious.
Not obvious. No, it's obvious to you and I, but I think generally speaking, it's not obvious. I think when you say Muslims believe, or Muslims are living in the 14th century or whatever it was that you said, I think that is always a real.
15th.
Sorry?
I think it's the 15th century.
Yeah, because it would be the 15th century. I think that is the, it's those things that really raise the flags and cause people to.
For sure. Of course, when I say they're living in the 15th century, that's according to the Islamic calendar. But Sam Harris believes that they are living in the 15th century in terms of moral development. And he said this was his opening gambit in his first book. I remember reading it and thinking, ooh, The End of Faith. He says, there are groups of people who are simply not as morally developed as others. Like anything, some people have lawnmowers, some people have developed the technology to see Saturn, and other groups of people haven't. And when they do discover similar technologies or the same technologies, they discover them at different times, or they receive them at different times. Why not also consider morality and a system of ethics to be just as susceptible to an incremental and distributed implementation throughout the population on the planet?
Well, the reason is the why.
And I think that's far more incendiary than anything else he's ever said. But
yeah, well, no, but what I was saying there was because you just asked, what's the reason why we don't talk about this ethics and morals and stuff like that? Is because you just don't. You just don't when it comes to talking about people of a different race who have different ideas. Everything's all equal, and if you suggest it isn't, then we have to marginalize you. And I think that's just a big part of this whole thing. It's people just raising bogeymen. It's like, bogeyman of racism, bogeyman of nationalism.
But there's a real potential societal problem with effectively generalizing. And that leads to the whole profiling argument, which I'm sure we'll get to. But
again, no, I don't know.
Before we do, I think it's important that it's extremely difficult to know what someone believes. So there we have ethics, and we can see how people behave in groups and societies. But what an individual actually believes is extremely difficult to determine. They can say they believe something, but they may not actually believe something. They may have been brainwashed into saying that they believe something when they don't even fully understand what it is that they believe. And if you take Christianity, for example, there are aspects to the faith that you simply cannot believe in. You literally have to take the faith on faith because it makes absolutely no sense and it's impossible to believe in. And you can stretch that argument to any supernatural belief system. How easy is it to genuinely believe in something that isn't there? I mean, you can say it, you can be conditioned to believe it, but do you actually believe it? Who knows? Nobody knows this. So we must judge on actions, and I think that's where Sam Harris gets a little bit blurry.
I
think necessarily so, because what Sam Harris is doing is he's saying, look, there's a threat, and we need to look ahead. Let's look down the road. Where is this going to lead? Whereas all of his interlocutors seem to look the other way. What has happened? An Islamic empire has never used a nuclear weapon. There's never been, an event where there's, mass killings of civilians down 100% to doctrinal motivations. But I think it's good that Sam Harris is looking ahead. He's saying, look, there's a coming problem, and we are, I think his phrase is, meandering into an apocalypse.
I think that's a difficult game to play about when someone says they believe X, to begin an assumption of maybe they don't believe X, or do they really believe X? And I think Sam's big thing is people behaving in a way that clearly demonstrates that they really do believe X. It's the link between beliefs and actions, beliefs and behaviors. Sure, Christians might not believe X. Like, for example, all the worst bits of the Old Testament, for example. Actually, Old Testament is probably not a good example. But what were you thinking of specifically when you said about Christians, not believing certain bits of the Bible because it would be impossible? What were you thinking?
The Trinity. I mean,
God is the Father, the Son,
cannot,
and the Holy Ghost. Yeah, but that's just faith.
It makes
you don't have to do anything about that.
It makes no logical sense. Again, you can say the words that you believe it. Yes, I believe it. But it's like believing in a square circle. You can say the words, but you cannot.
I just got around that. I said it's about behavior. It's like, of course you could say I believe.
No, but you're missing a link here. So somebody can say that they believe something so strongly that they'll kill somebody for it. And then they can actually perpetrate that action and kill somebody and still not actually believe the motivation. They could have been brainwashed by a very charismatic peer into thinking they believe what they profess to believe, but in fact, they do not.
But
and
also,
there have been studies along these lines where they have taken CAT scans and MRIs of brain centers which light up with certain beliefs. And they have had individuals who present the behaviors you would expect for somebody who believes, but in fact, their areas of their brain are not lighting up. They're going through the motions, they're performing the behavioral characteristics of the belief, but actually, you question whether or not they really do believe or they believe something else. And usually, it's something imbibed into their brains from a charismatic conditioner. So that's why, to maintain these belief systems, you have to invest an awful lot of work. And that work is usually along the lines of brainwashing. In Islam, you have the madrasas, which drum into children beliefs that are incredible to the point where you don't actually have the mental muscles to comprehend what it is you're trying to believe because it just flat out doesn't make sense to anybody's brain.
Yeah, but lots of things don't make sense. Yeah, but what about, but it's not like, apart from a few exceptions to this, the examples that they're getting in the people's head are from the Hadith and the Quran.
Yeah, absolutely.
The example of the Prophet and all this other stuff. So this charismatic demagogue that you were talking about. So what's the motivation here?
Control, power, empire building, or perhaps that individual does genuinely believe, but his acolytes perhaps do not, but they want to because, respect for authority, they want to be told what to do, they want to do the right thing, a million reasons, especially if they're younger brains. I think this is where Sam Harris, I think, builds false analogies because he can say things like, would you believe something physical in the physical world? And, that's just like believing in a particular religious doctrine when I think it's not the same. Believing that there is a grizzly bear behind a door and believing in something that's supernatural, I think these are fundamentally different types of belief. Not just believing in different things, but believing in a different type of belief. I just think, again, it takes a massive amount of time and commitment to maintain a system of belief. You have to have churches. You have to have people constantly talking about it. You have to have rules. You have to have books and texts. I mean, biblical texts do not jump at you off of shelves. They just sit there. It's a book. It's a book full of words, and it's not going to convince you of anything unless somebody is helping you be convinced.
I don't know. I mean, again, you're doing a jank in just saying that. I think there's certainly something to be said for what is actually inside of that book. And I think Sam,
I'm not saying that there isn't. I'm just saying
you're saying it's just a book. It's not going to jump out at you.
It is just a book, and it isn't going to jump out at you. But in the right hands, the ideas flow and they are conducted. Right? Okay. That's how it works. You have to. I mean, Judaism, for instance, is not an evangelical faith, but it is. because when you are a Jewish child, you're reading all of the texts. You're told to read them. You're read them. You read them. Every word. You learn it off by heart. It's, again, a massive amount of time. It's just not going to happen unless you're pushed into it. And the more religious societies, the more heavily dependent they are on human conductivity of ideas. And yes, the ideas can be benign, they can be dangerous, but really it's the people and their motivations to inculcate these ideas into other brains. That's the problem. If it's a dangerous idea, and there are dangerous ideas, and there are good dangerous ideas, like the idea of evolution by natural selection. That's a very dangerous idea because it can really change the way you think in ways that might change the relationship you have with your immediate peers and family and in-group. So that's a dangerous idea, but again, it helps to have it conducted by people you respect or fear.
Okay. All right. Okay. Maybe we should start talking about the actual conversation.
Sure.
Okay.
As I say, it was very long, and I really struggled, but I think a lot of value there. It was very long.
I didn't find it arduous.
And it was hard. It was hard to follow along because, I mean, Cenk kept interrupting in really unfortunate points in the conversation. It made him look like a buffoon every time he interrupted, and it reduced the value of his ideas, which he had, and the points that he made, I think, could have been made better if he just maintained his decorum. But he just couldn't because he's a sort of gregarious guy, and he certainly comes across as an apologist for Islam, even though, as I understand, reading around, that he constantly denies this.
Yeah, he did keep sort of interrupting Sam, but as Sam Harris said, because he wrote a blog post after the conversation, where he said most of Cenk's arguments to Sam were about how a misunderstanding of Sam's views are dangerous. It's like, sure, yeah, of course, misunderstanding of Sam's views dangerous, but how does that actually challenge Sam's argument? It's like, that doesn't make any sense at all. That just sounds like he
was mounting a defense for the ignorant.
Yeah, exactly. It was a crappy...
Unfortunately, Sam, your arguments are far too sophisticated for most people to follow, and the highlights for them will be that you are a racist torturer who is in favor of a nuclear first strike against
the Muslim world. Yeah, no, exactly that. And this is what I said earlier about how Sam's, his views, or as you said, very complicated, that can't be reduced to a sentence, but other people do the reducing for him. And Cenk, I think, knows this to some extent, but plays on that, which is what I mean about how dishonest he is. The fact that he is appealing clearly with what he says and what he writes, what he said subsequently, is, again, appealing to the people who also like to misrepresent Sam's words, and I think deliberately so. I think not all of them believe that Sam Harris is a racist and a bigot and wants to execute a nuclear first strike against the Muslim world.
Indeed.
But I think that they just come out with these things because it's cool to come out with these things.
It's called quote bait.
Yeah, and I think that there's some kind of very twisted sort of moral zeitgeist where it is cool to come or to attack anyone who says anything, the kind of things that Sam says. If you're not being completely level about it, if you're saying one thing is better than another, or there is a problem. Actually, I just want to quickly segue into something that this just reminded me of here. I actually was Googling bombings, right? I thought, what's the deal here? Because every time Sam Harris would talk about violence, for example, Cenk would always very quickly bring other examples, into the mix, and that sort of BBC fairness thing. So Sam Harris would talk about a suicide bombing, somewhere in the Middle East that seemed to happen every day. And then Cenk would then talk about, well, in Ireland, when you had the Catholics and the Protestants and all this kind of thing, as if you got to be careful here to make sure that anytime you say anything, you have to then bring other things in there, so you're not singling any one thing
No,
out.
I think
Let me just say, I Googled bombings right in recent times. You can't help but notice that they all tend to be of a Muslim persuasion or of Islamic persuasion, and that's just
but Cenk's argument is that, and the reason why he brought up the Irish troubles is that the motivation for these bombings is because of oppression. So he said in his Irish example that if asked, the Republicans would have said, "Yeah, we'll kill them all."
Kill them all. Yeah.
Exactly.
I like it, Sam goes,
and the reason why they would say
entirely from your imagination.
The reason why they might say that is because they are occupied. They feel oppressed. They are being actively suppressed. And similarly, the Palestinians, and similarly, I suppose you could argue, the Muslims in the Middle East who believe the Americans have far too much of an economic hold and military presence in the area to escape similar protest.
Okay, well, let me just say about that. I mean, that's not really in dispute. I think what Sam's talking about is this unique character of Islamic violence, this whole suicide bombing thing, for example. There wasn't really much suicide bombing happening in Northern Ireland, for example. There wasn't this death cult, as I think was what Sam Harris would describe it. So I just think it was kind of specious, all of these extra examples that what's his face, Cenk would sort of bring to the mix, as if to say, let me stop you there, that Christians have been just as bad. Look at Northern Ireland, etc.
Oh no, but that was a very specific example, though, and that example was they would have said things that they wouldn't normally say. Similarly, as Cherie Blair once said, blowing themselves up is all they can do. If their culture and religious doctrine affords immolation in defense of the faith, then that's going to happen. So that is a specific example of doctrine informing behavior, as Sam points out. So that's his straight line argument between ideology and behavior, which I think is a good one.
It's not just that.
There were the Buddhists in Myanmar, of course, but
that's the other example. But it's Sam, I think he explains that very well by talking about there isn't a straight line there. And actually, what that was self-immolation. Whereas, actually, we're kind of veering off again. Let's start from the conversation.
Well, the conversation starts off with Sam Harris making the point that the reason for the interview is that he wanted to address the defamation and the problem with modern journalism as he sees it. And I certainly see this as well. I'm very sympathetic with this, taking words out of context and not dedicating the time it takes to fully understand somebody's approach on a particular topic, and just sensationalizing, which has always been around, of course. Yes. And having a financial motivation for character assassination, which I think is particularly egregious, but certainly does happen. So Sam Harris considers all of these articles that disparage his views by misrepresentation as hit pieces, and they're terrible. Salon is a website that is again, I certainly never considered Salon to be journalism. So that's interesting. It never even occurred to me that that's journalism. I never thought it was. I mean, I don't even think The Guardian is journalism.
The point Harris is making is that they're not journalism. But
exactly,
But I think they are viewed as journalism, whereas they don't have like a journalistic code of ethics. This stuff isn't reliably sourced. Whereas people will come to these sites make those assumptions. Whereas, as Sam Harris says, they're just maniacs in their bedrooms. And then Cenk, he then had this false analogy where, Salon and whatever else had come to me saying that Sam Harris said this about us, and Sam Harris hasn't seen the body of our work, as if that makes a difference. That didn't make any sense what he said at all. It's like Sam Harris saw what they said about him. That's all he needs to see. Why does he need to read the entire canon of the work of Salam before he then says anything about their dishonesty and their misrepresentation of his views? So that just clearly just didn't make sense. And I think that brings me on to how unsophisticated Cenk is as a thinker. Because at 1 minute 40 in, when he says this blanket statement, and he goes, "I'm against all religions, and you're against all religions," and Sam Harris sort of felt duty bound to say, "Yeah. But don't you think that's a kind of simplistic way to sort of start the conversation? I mean, what does it even mean? You're against religions."
I don't even know what it means. What could that mean? The only thing I can imagine it means is that they're both atheists. He says, "I don't believe." I mean,
exactly.
You're not. Sam Harris has never considered himself to be an anti-theist like his good friend Christopher, the late Christopher Hitchens.
Yes.
But they agree that they are both atheists in terms of the discussion.
Yeah.
I'm sure they can get very atomistic with that definition and really get into it, and they'll probably disagree on a few points. But generally speaking, for the sake of the argument, they are both atheists, which I believe. I think they are both atheists.
Yes,
I don't know
although
that much, but what I have heard from him, he sounds like he doesn't sound like a believer.
Oh no, I believe him that he's not. But he did say during the interview, he said, "I'm not a Muslim, but we all get wedded to our identities, no matter how much we try and deny it." And I think he was letting us know that even though he's an atheist, because he was a Muslim, he feels some kind of loyalty in defending actions that could be perceived as inspired by the teachings of Muhammad or whatever.
Which is only natural. I mean, I think we can let him slide on that one.
But it's a little bit of a sort of admitting up front his sort of bias. Okay, so they start off with this conversation about the ethics of journalism, and they were going round and round again, and where then Cenk came up with this false analogy about you haven't seen the body of our work, talking about Salon. And then I like it when Sam Harris goes, "Let's get into the details because this isn't going anywhere." and I like how when most of us, like I tend to a lot and stuff like that. When Sam Harris speaks, it's like every little word is like somehow very carefully considered and stuff. And I thought that was quite a good example of that. Okay, so that took about maybe 15 minutes of the conversation. I think they were talking about that before they got into the details. I'm looking at the notes that you've written here.
Well, yeah, at nearly 9 minutes in, Cenk talks about criticism, and he doesn't understand the difference between criticizing someone's opinions, someone's viewpoints, confusing that with simply misrepresenting what they said, straw man style, and then just straight up defamation. He seems these all seem to blur into one sort of wobbly hole for Cenk, and he thinks that the best way, the cure, is to have a follow-up conversation and give airtime to the injured parties, which is one way to do it. But a better way to do it is prevention and correcting misrepresentations as they happen.
Yeah, and honesty.
But that again, that requires work. It's not easy, especially with sophisticated topics. But I think Cenk could certainly do a lot more. And these are the sort of journalistic attributes that I think any sort of news outfit would really strive to have. And it seems as though that there's a serious dearth of such skills on internet sites for sure, and the media generally at large. I think it's draining away into nothingness, and it's all about quote mining and clickbait. As Sam Harris said when he was speaking of Salam, he was misrepresented, but he was invited to do some work for Salam and produce some text,
some content for them for free.
Yeah, and then they'll be happy to have all of those visitors come and read his work for them.
I liked it how he then said, and I feel like that's what's happening with you. Here I am, Cenk. Very shortly after
on the most popular interview ever on that network.
you heard that on his podcast. I'd be interested to know what the numbers are there.
It's very popular. The Young Turks.
That interview has got like 1 million views already. Anyway, so before the 20-minute mark, Cenk is wrong twice, and they're the same kind of wrong things where he just says stuff. And one of which was he says, when you're talking about the doctrines, you're not going to get much disagreement from non-believers. And that was just flat out wrong. It's like, what are you talking about? They got 50 million other people who give him grief. And so he was just wrong. And then Cenk was also wrong about this technical detail about this thing that you've written here, the probability theory of degrees of wrongness. Should we read this a little bit of your show?
Yeah, he points out that measuring the distance between absurdities is unnecessary, which is a point. But in that specific example, that's not the case. I can see where Sam's coming from there. And I think Cenk should have granted that, and he could have, but he didn't. So I think he lost points there for me.
So on many of these points, you are talking about a majority of Muslims believing X. So you're talking about 75%. You're talking about, so if it's a belief that the Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe, that is incredibly well subscribed. Every poll I've ever seen on that puts that at 90%. Just through wherever
would be the same.
It wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be the same. Like, we can talk about those polls, but it's not. It's not in fact the same. It's half of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Christians also believe that the Quran is perfect word. I mean, again, heavy reliance on polls when it comes to religious faith that is a mistake.
Why?
Because they're like, any kind of survey on very personal topics is you have to grant several standard deviations away from reality. I think, I'm not going to tell you what I really think, especially if I don't actually know what I really think. I'll tell you what I believe people might want me to think.
Well, there were certain countries that didn't allow the polling.
But relatively, and Sam Harris has made this argument, he says, look, he grants that there could be major inaccuracies with some of these polls, but it's a relative game. So, it's completely out, but is it more out than this survey that's held in similar conditions in a different country, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's reasonable to use these statistics as he does. But, there's going to be a lot of bet hedgery, I think. Do you believe in the divine nature of the Quran? I think you might, even if you don't, you're not really going to say you don't, just in case. It's the Pascal's wager argument.
No, it's not. It's not just the just in case thing. It's also there might be fear for you to be critical of certain things because of how brutal the consequences are. I mean, this is a slight aside, but you saw some, when that guy, the jihadi John, was kind of revealed as to who he was. He's this guy who had this degree in computer science or something like that.
Yes.
And then you had some like apologist from some British think tank go on that show with Brillo, what's his name? Andrew Neil. And Andrew Neil was actually really good with asking questions and stuff. And he asked him to denounce, he goes, well, what do you think?
Sorry, this is the Cage spokesperson.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, yeah.
And when on the Andrew Neil show, whatever it's called, he was asked these questions about, would you denounce the stoning to death of adulterers and the something else that was just absolutely horrible? And he wouldn't. He just wouldn't do it. He wriggled around and was very sort of politician-like in how he just dodged the question. He wouldn't even say it. And I don't think it's because he actually thinks that it's a good idea to stone adulterers. I think it's because of the backlash that would have happened had he have said, no, obviously stoning adulterers is a terrible thing to do. You shouldn't do it. Because I think he would have got a lot of people on his ass, that he represents, saying, how could you go on and say that? This is told to us by the prophet, and it's written down for us, and it's all this other stuff.
Or he really does believe in stoning adulterers.
Well, yeah, there is that fact, but
that's a point.
I gave him the benefit of the doubt there.
Yeah, so that's a moral philosophy point. I mean, who's to say that that isn't actually better for society? Perhaps we would all be living in a better world if we upheld that dictum to the letter. Would there not be, perhaps there wouldn't be any adultery ever. And maybe that would lead to a much better world. Who knows? So again, this is another small issue I take with Sam Harris, which I'm sure he could iron out if we were ever to have a conversation, and that is objectivity with morality. Are there objective morals? I'm not sure.
Jeff, Sam, if you're listening,
please clear this up. Yeah, so who's to say stoning adulterers is a morally bad thing? And I'll tell you who's to say. It's us. or them. It's if you think it's wrong, then it's wrong for you. There is a certain amount of responsibility you have to take when rolling the moral dice, and I think it's right for us to take issue with stoning adulterers, because the society that we live in, we don't tolerate that, and we think it's absolutely barbaric and horrific. Not everybody may think the same, but we do, so you have to act. You can't just be, I say, fair about this and say, oh, that's just the way they are. It's part of their culture. We shouldn't intervene. And this reminds me of an argument that Richard Dawkins made about the Amish, and that it's wrong not to intervene. These people are having children, and their children are completely unaware of the world. They have no idea. Again, it's another hostage crisis, and he thinks it's morally reprehensible of the rest of society to let this persist without reasonable intervention. And he has an argument. So this scares lots of very liberal, in the pejorative sense, people who think, aha, imperialism, aha, statism, this is bad news.
Certainly,
slippery slope.
If you are targeting the Amish, for example, I mean, how much of a threat to the world is the Amish, or are the Amish?
But that's not the point. The point is,
it's
we
fine.
can intervene, not because they're a threat, but because they are morally wrong.
Well, yeah, but again, as we just discussed, that's slippery slope. But I think intervention is when it crosses my line. Like, for example, if I feel, something is innocuous to most people, like circumcision, I feel like that crosses my line. And yeah, absolutely, I think there should be steps taken to eradicate such a practice. And normal people will challenge me on that. And that's fine.
Again,
there are degrees of that.
But it's a slippery slope. I mean, where will it stop?
It is.
Yeah, you may think, forcing children to brush their own hair is horrifically cruel, and these people should
I'll tell you where it stops: the Holocaust. So anyway, so we've got so straw men up the arse. So at 35 minutes in, Cenk goes, so Sam Harris, basically, you think Islam is irredeemable. And it's like, what the hell? Sam Harris never said it's irredeemable. And he even said, he goes, I hope it's not irredeemable. There's a lot riding on us redeeming this. And then Cenk goes, Christianity is just as violent. They want Armageddon. And then he goes, this thing I said earlier, Christianity is by far, historically, the most violent religion on the planet. I said, well, where did he get that from? He just pulled that out of his ass.
Oh, he's just thinking of the Crusades and the Inquisition, basically. And which was a terrible chapter. And I think Sam Harris does concede the fact that, well, and he does this in his Faith book. He says,
I have to stop you there,
imagine the Inquisition, or imagine the Crusades happening today, but with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's right. But also,
that's not something you want to come into a circumstance.
But the reason why I flagged that up, and I thought this was a very significant marker of just how insignificant Cenk was, and also how intellectually out of his depth, I thought he was speaking to Sam Harris about this. How, by saying, when he said this thing, Christianity by far the most violent, it's not just the Crusades and the Inquisition. He's talking about the two world wars. He thinks they're Christian wars. So
they could well have been.
No, they were not.
I think Christianity, I mean, think about it. If most of the people participating have any
Christians.
have any particular leniency towards a faith, it would behoove you as a commander to use that as a control mechanism to motivate atrocities.
No. But that just doesn't run through. And I don't even think that you believe that there's any truth in that, because
Hitler did say he was doing God's work in eradicating the Jews.
Yeah, but that's not why we went to war. We didn't even know about the Holocaust when war was declared. So Hitler was totally wrong there.
Hitler always wanted a better society. You know, eugenics was quite popular at the time.
That's not why we went to war.
No, but he thought, well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it was certainly.
That's what he said. He goes, Muslims didn't start the First World War. And then when Sam Harris said
there was this Christian, the hatred of the Jews is a Christian invention.
Yes.
So there was a motivation to stem the rising tide of Jews in terms of population and power, and that comes from a Christian background. So there's a Christian basis there, I think. So there are motivating factors for sure that were faith-based. Again, which is Sam's point. There you have specific beliefs that manifest themselves in specific behaviors.
No. I just disagree with everything you've just said. The first two world wars were not started because of Christianity. That's a ridiculous statement. That's ridiculous on its face.
I didn't say that. I didn't say it started because of. I did not. I didn't say it.
That's what Cenk said.
Because of Christianity. I like Cenk, believe that it is a mixture of causes.
Sam thinks
it's not necessarily one thing. One factor may move a decision to a tipping point, perhaps, but I think generally there needs to be a lot of different components together in order to motivate certainly violent actions. I believe it's not just one thing.
Well, it's never just one thing, but I think that was a good, clear example of just how Cenk just pulls stuff out of his ass and people just lap it up, because to me that was a ridiculous thing to say on its face, as if somehow it was some Christian conquest or something like that. And he actually did mention the Holocaust as if, what was he saying? I can't remember what he said exactly, but he was talking about how the Holocaust is somehow sort of like sanctioned in the Bible. Is it sanctioned? No, not sanctioned. It's somehow what's it called? I can't remember. But Sam Harris was saying, "Of course it is. It says kill them all." Yeah, but Harris was like flabbergasted. He's saying, "No, it doesn't. Not for Christianity. It just simply does not." So he was just by that point in the conversation, I was thinking, what the hell? What is this conversation exactly? Sam Harris is talking to a moron.
Cenk tried to establish equivalence with the insanity of the various faiths. All religions are equally bad. And that's important for him to try and establish. And I think Sam's mostly evidence-based reasoning suggests that just isn't the case, unfortunately. We have a real problem with Islam. Perhaps Christianity 500 years ago was at a similar sort of stage where the more horrific tracts in the Bible were played out against society. But now, he says, now is now. We are where we are. And right now, the biggest threat to global security is the doctrines of Islam.
Ooh, careful.
Now, I'm sort of with A.C. Grayling when he says religion, generally speaking, is in its death throes. And what we're seeing is a lot of fireworks at the end, but it's going. It may be another couple of 100 years, but it's doomed ultimately.
Yeah, but the question is, are we going to make it another 100 years before?
Exactly, which is an excellent point, because we really do have weapons of mass destruction. We have failed states who are lax with their maintenance of weapons of mass destruction.
And we have people who want to die.
And when we see groups like ISIS getting very savvy with the use of media and the use of technology, one wonders, how difficult would it be to get a hold of a canister of nerve agent or some sort of biological toxin or even a dirty bomb. It's a reasonable fear, and I think we need to think about it. We have to have that conversation, and I think certainly Sam Harris is at the forefront, and it's just very unfortunate that he's being lambasted by such a rabble of buffoonery at every turn.
That does bring us on to the thing that he said, which I did write down, which is the, I can't find it, but he said, okay, Sam, what do we do? What do we do? And I think this is sort of a meme that goes around. Everyone seems to think, yeah, well, Sam Harris says this stuff, but
what is the solution?
But he said, I wrote it down, he goes, to talk about this. And
that's easy.
Yeah, he goes, that's easy. It's like, okay, you've been in this conversation for the last 2 hours or whatever. It's clearly not easy. So again, that's another right on its face. It was just like Cenk being just such a dumbass by saying something like that.
It is a toughie, though. I mean, really, the perfect solution would be if everybody just renounced their faith, and there were no love of death and notions of paradise, which Sam Harris certainly finds dangerous. And of course it is. If you believe in his words that this world is an antechamber for the next much better world, then you have a lot less to lose. And indeed, you might even find yourself in a situation whereby getting to the next world as explosively as possible is a good idea, especially when you have a doctrine of martyrdom, which certainly does exist in the Quran.
Yes.
And if you are genuinely defending the faith, then you are rewarded in an afterworld. And also you get there straight away, which is not true of just simple death. If you die, you don't immediately go to heaven, just like in the Christian Bible. Nobody's in heaven right now, technically speaking, because Jesus hasn't returned yet. Well, it's only when Jesus returns, then we are judged, and then we get to heaven.
There's lots of different interpretations on that one.
Of course there are interpretations, because the Bibles are Bibles and not instructions on how to build a chair. If they were instructions on how to build a chair, interpretation would not be necessary. They're the instructions, build the chair, no controversy, no problem.
Yeah, but the books are so awesome. So, I mean, the books are awesome. So how is it that they're confusing? That doesn't make any sense.
Yes, well, that's religion. I think that's another podcast.
That is also something which I think is quite an interesting one that Harris talks about, which is the difference between actual differences between the faiths. How, and this is a big point, how that the Quran has a very straightforward message. Kill, subjugate, convert the non-believer, conquer.
Yes, I mean,
whereas the Bible's a long and rambling
religion.
Yes, that's
the Quran isn't that straightforward. I've read the Quran, and it's very confusing, and it seems to need a lot of supporting material.
Right.
It's peculiar. You have the Imam, which is the 6 pillars, and there's no jihad mentioned in there. And it's massively open to interpretation, and obviously there are different sects, and like any main so-called main religion, there are lots of different systems of belief and interpretations. And more Muslims are killed by Muslims than anybody else, of course. Is that famous statistic?
Well, that's what I was saying earlier about what did the West do in furthering that? I mean, maybe they did. I don't know, but it seems like a lot of people forget that it's actually a lot of sort of infighting.
I think Sam Harris also grants to Cenk the fact that American foreign policy doesn't help it along the road to global peace. I mean, we are kicking the hornet's nest on a daily basis, and this is not a good thing. It's a separate argument, perhaps, to his straight line from ideology, but the simple fact of the matter is America is an interventionist, quasi-imperialistic power, which is all over the place and putting a lot of pressure on Muslim countries in lots of different ways. And that's true. And I think perhaps too many so-called liberal thinkers put too much emphasis on this, perhaps, to the detriment of understanding the ideological framework underneath, which is a pressure from below, if you will.
Yes.
I think it is true, and Sam Harris certainly accepts this, and he thinks, he's just as angry as anybody else at how America simply refuses to remove its military bases from Saudi Arabia, all of its oil deals, and how it profits from the suffering of a lot of people.
Yes, indeed.
And its continued friendship with Israel, who certainly are occupying and containing Islamic territories. I say Islamic territories that contain Muslims in a sort of, again, a hostage situation. They don't have either, they can't trade with other countries, and they have to speak through the filter of Israel and all the rest of it. So I can understand there's a lot of frustration throughout the Islamic world. Although I've never really seen a big Islamic or Muslim brotherhood happening. They often say this, but whenever a country was invaded, like the Gulf War I in the 80s, I didn't see the Muslim empire rallying together to fight off the Iranians or anything. I mean, it loses me. I don't see such a brotherhood in terms of trade and defense agreements and all the rest of it. But again, this is another one of Sam Harris's arguments, in that they simply don't have the institutions in place. They don't have the framework, and they need to build that, because there are too many power vacuums and there are too many failed states, and it's all falling down. And when everything's falling down, people aren't happy, and that increases the number of agitated attacks on other countries. Again, culture and geopolitical climate contributing towards the animosities of an oppressed peoples, which I believe, again, nothing happens in isolation, and there are always multiple factors motivating people to do anything.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we're coming up to the hour mark. I don't know if you want to talk about the other things that they spoke about in the conversation, the profiling.
Yeah, profiling. I mean, Sam Harris has spoken about this at length. He believes it's a waste. We shouldn't be wasting our time when it comes to the security and safety of our borders and airplanes. Airplanes are incredibly dangerous, because not only can you crash them and kill everybody aboard, but they can be crashed into populated areas, an incredible amount of collateral damage, which also something, a topic Sam Harris talks at length about.
Yes.
But the people who vet the travelers boarding planes, they profile in their minds. They're highly trained to spot people who are nervous, who are perspiring.
You talk about any particular security?
So the argument goes, if a very distinct type of person has been responsible for prior bombings or terrorism or problems, abuse, then you kind of want to, or you probably won't have a choice. You'll be effectively looking at those people with an extra eye for trouble. So to positively discriminate against people who you believe, based on evidence, might present the biggest problem is a good idea. Because why would you want to waste your time with people who have never been a problem? And when I say people, this is the issue. Who are those people? Is it a color? Is it a size? Is it a nationality? Is it a belief? How do you do this?
I think
the argument against this is to vet people utterly randomly as they come into an airport intending to board a plane is the best way to do it. Because even though you could well be wasting your time by patting down that 2-year-old or getting that person in the wheelchair to get up and take the shoes off, I suppose they would need to get up to take the shoes off, but it doesn't put pressure on the people who do the checking. You know, they don't have to think about it. They're just doing it randomly. It suits them better. It doesn't stress them out. And it also doesn't give them the power to positively discriminate against people unnecessarily, perhaps, which is bad. And this is Cenk's argument. It's bad generally for society because then you start dividing society up. You know, all the terrorists came from your population, therefore we're ring fencing you as an entire population and looking at every single one of you suspiciously. That's not fair. But you know, how far do we take fairness? And Sam Harris believes that we take it to a liberal extreme that is devoid of reality. And I can see the argument for both sides, but I think positive discrimination in order to keep people safe on airplanes is generally a good idea, but within reason. You know, actions and behavior over nationality and color.
I thought Sam Harris explained it really well, and it didn't strike me as being particularly racist or anything like that. And I can see it's one of those things where people will go away from it and, you know, say a bunch of crap. But I like the idea of not obviously wasting time spending too much resources on someone who couldn't possibly be a jihadi terrorist or whatever, or terrorist.
Yeah, but again, I mean, couldn't possibly be? Really? How would you know? You know, if you have a very strict profile, you're going to try to get around that profile.
Trained professionals who know to recognize the cues.
Yeah, but you can't rule anity out. You're gonna
strict professionals probably could. And I think the example Harris brings is that they had this family that could be overheard and could be viewed by professionals who are able to tune into their actions and stuff. And then they searched the shoes of their 4-year-old daughter. And I think he saw that as some kind of ridiculous.
They could have had bombs in them.
Of theater.
They could have had bombs in them.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about the argument to really comment too much on it, but it certainly made sense when Sam Harris said it to me. Not to me personally.
Well, the sentiment, we shouldn't be obviously wasting our time. Well, you could apply that to anything. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that in almost every context that you can possibly imagine. We shouldn't be wasting our time looking at brown bananas in the supermarket. Yes, I agree. We shouldn't be wasting our time. So how much is that worth? But how do you do it? That's the point. Do we randomize it? Or do we absolutely every dark-skinned person that comes in, extra attention on them? There's a cost for that in terms of humanity.
But it is something that is being done right now. He spoke about this what are they called, El Al in
yes, the Israelis. Yeah, they're really good at it.
Yeah, and he says, you know, they make no bones about it. You know, they don't want the plane to blow up, and they're not going to be polite about how they're going to determine whether or not you are or aren't a bomber. And I thought that was an interesting example. And looking into that, it's like, okay, well, these guys don't mess around. They're not worried about being politically correct.
But put yourself in the position of somebody who fits the profile. That's, you know, that it's not nice. It's not nice being stopped and being absolutely delayed and being taken to a room and having loads of personal questions and lots of phone calls. And imagine that all the time, just because you have a particular skin tone. You wouldn't want to live like that. You know, you wouldn't want to live in that country.
Yeah, but this is the world we live in.
How do we offset that?
We offset this by having this ridiculous charade of getting 4-year-old or whatever. Anyway, I don't know enough about this, and I think by talking about it, I'll stray into a territory which
Let's stray into torture. So they also had a little discussion about Sam Harris's stance on torture.
Yeah, can I just say about torture?
Misrepresentation of his views about torture.
Yeah, can I just, on the whole torture thing, torture is treated like kind of pornography or something. It's like if you bring up torture, then everyone kind of recoils and has to then stand up and renounce the whole concept of it, this, that, and the other.
Everyone?
It does seem like everyone. If I'm reading message boards and stuff, and the general chatter online, particularly when talking about Harris, is that he's an apologist for torture. And it kind of got me thinking, it's like, why is torture such a bad thing?
Well,
what's the big deal?
It's definitely a slippery slope argument. I think
It
that's
is
what turns people off.
slippery slope argument, but you don't have to have that much of an imagination to imagine a scenario, as Sam Harris says, where you could imagine torture being absolutely justified in order to save lives. And people often trot out this thing: torture has never worked. It has never worked. It's never worked. You know, and I think they're just, I don't know.
There are famous cases where it hasn't worked.
There are what?
There are famous cases where it has not worked. It simply has not worked. And there will always be instances where it won't work. But there are also easy thought experiments that you can create whereby it would be the moral thing to do. And the argument against that is, well, those are thought experiments. They're not reality. Reality is a completely different animal. And you know, to the point where you have to make these moral decisions as they happen. It's not something you can even speculate about. But an example of a simple thought experiment is somebody walks into a police station and says, "I have put a bomb in a school. It's going to go off in 15 minutes, and here's a mobile phone that I can tap a code into, and it'll deactivate the bomb. But I'm not going to do it, and I'm not going to tell you what school it's in." Now, that's a very specific example, which may never happen. But in that example, wouldn't you be morally justified in making that person, as Sam Harris would say, uncomfortable to try and get the information out of him? He's telling you he knows the information that you want to acquire. He's telling you he knows it. So unless he's a complete, well, he obviously is a psychopath, but unless he's a psychopathic copycat, you're going to do it, I think. So, you know, these are trolley experiments that are quandaries morally. And, you know, it reminds me of Captain Kirk, where rather than being faced with an unwinnable situation, he just reprogrammed the computers. There must be some way out.
I don't know. When I had my one of my wisdom teeth removed, I remember thinking how there's no way I'd hold any information in under those circumstances. And I think there are bad people in the world.
But Cenk's point is not that you wouldn't give up information. It's that when you're being tortured, you will tell your torturer whatever you think they want to hear.
Yeah, that was one example.
Whether it's the truth or not.
Yeah, he had one example of that, and I'd be interested to see the numbers, really, and unbiased.
I doubt you could ever find the numbers on something like that.
Well, this is what
torture
I mean.
Torture is something that all states pretty much keep fairly secret.
The topic of torture is this thing where Sam Harris is completely marginalized. It's like, nope, I just don't want to even go there. He supports torture. And it's like, whoa, hang on a minute. Let's talk about torture. And it just seems to me that, as you brought up earlier, this idea of collateral damage,
which is terribly, awfully horrific. And I've always thought that. I mean, it's just the worst thing. Yeah. It is the worst eventuality of any action.
Yes.
And you don't even want to think about it. And people don't want to think about it. And unfortunately, it's not talked about. I absolutely think it should. And I think this is one of the best topics that Sam Harris can use as a tool to get this conversation into people's brains. I think, look, at all costs, we need to dodge that bullet. And we should have an open and honest discussion about collateral damage in terms of intervention and especially in terms of negligence, not intervening and not doing something and it leading to collateral damage. And we need to equate that with actions against our own people and actions against the innocent people who are caught up in such horror. I think we've hit everything, all the highlights in the interview, and had a reasonably good discussion about the defamation and the ongoing defamation of Sam Harris. We have a little bit of music, though, to play out. And before I tell you what that is, just to mention once more that we have a website, and it is eclecticist.co.uk. And you can go there and leave feedback. Please do. You can enjoy our back catalogue of previous shows. And if you have any ideas, to suggest, please make those suggestions, and we'll slot them in, and we'll have a discussion. At our website also, the show notes, everything we've been talking about, any references or further research that we conduct will pop on that page. But our music is a piece called a muwashaha. It's an ancient Middle Eastern musical and poetic form. It's very popular, has always been very popular, and it's still played often today. The best and most representative piece is called When She Begins to Sway, or Lama Bara Yatahana, and it dates back evidently to the 10th century. So it's quite rich in the lute, or oud, and a box zither, which is sort of like a flat guitar-looking instrument called a kanun, which is customary for this particular music. And this piece is performed by a lute virtuoso, and his name is John Beleze Kajan. I'm sure I've butchered that name. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.